Hey folks. Okay. Thank you. Welcome to this incredibly fascinating discussion on the capital gains tax proposals from the Tax Working Group. We've had quite a lot of talk in the media about this. I've been seeing a little bit of chatter on the email today because I got some secret heads-ups on what these guys are going to say. I can see it's quite contentious, and I know you've all got lots of questions. So the format is this. We're going to invite the speakers to speak 5 to 7 minutes each. If they say something that's incomprehensibly economo-speak, then you're allowed to interject and get them to explain themselves. We don't want any technical jargon here. Thank you very much. Okay. If Peter starts talking about a beard tax in Russia, we'll stop him there. You can talk to him about that afterwards. At the end, I get to ask a Patsy question, and then you get to ask your questions. So that's how we're going to roll it, and it's Peter on first, the biggest beard. Ta-da.
New beard. Cheers, everyone. I used to be the Director of Tax Policy at the Treasury, and about every 7 years, tax becomes popular in New Zealand. So this is my time to shine for about 3 days, and then I go back into my chrysalis. What I want to talk about is some background of what New Zealand isn't, to sort of introduce the discussion about capital gains tax. And what New Zealand isn't is a rich country. We do not have lots and lots of billionaires in New Zealand. So as far as I'm aware, we have no billionaires who live in New Zealand. We have no tech millionaires who have got rich coming up with ideas like they have in America. In America, there are lots and lots and lots of people with enormous untaxed capital gains. Mr. Zuckerberg is one of them. He started a company with $200 borrowed from someone else. He's now worth X billion. Hasn't paid a cent of tax on that yet. So in America, having a capital gains tax is pretty important because there's lots and lots of very rich people who, if you didn't have one, wouldn't be paying much tax because they earn their income through the accrual of the value of the shares of the companies that they've founded. The 1% in New Zealand, here's a little pop quiz. How much income do you have to earn in New Zealand to be in the top 1% of taxpayers? I told you that this morning, boss. You didn't hear? Well, okay. Does anyone think, how much do you have to be? To be in the top 1% of income tax earners in New Zealand, what would you be earning a year?
$1 million.
No.
Peter, use the microphone. Just
No.
so people can hear it.
So- Sorry, no, not $1 million. Any advance on $1 million? No. Higher. No, it's 230,000. 230,000, you're in the top 1% taxpayers in New Zealand. That's probably what Bill Gates earns in a day. We're just not a rich country. So when you're thinking about the equity advantages of capital gains tax, remember who New Zealand is. The other thing to remember about New Zealand is that we're a growing economy. We've been growing basically since 1992. GDP per capita is going up nicely at about 1.5%. Real wages in New Zealand are going up and have been in the last cycle since about 2008. After-tax wages have been really going up a lot for working people because governments keep reducing the tax rate through working for families regimes. So I would argue that the New Zealand tax system and New Zealand basically is still a pretty egalitarian country, and the equity case for taxing capital income, more capital income, I think is pretty weak. That's my view of the tax review. And if you wanted to increase the progressive income tax system, I'd put the top marginal tax rate up.
What to?
Whatever number you want to make the tax system more progressive. It's 33, 34, will raise a few $100 million. 35 will raise some more. You could then distribute that by reducing the bottom tax rate, but because 1% of people earn over $230,000, you'd only reduce the bottom tax rate by a very small amount, because there just aren't that many rich people to tax in New Zealand. Someone had a question?
Intuitively, when I look at the sort of asset accumulation that's happening and the sort of divide in this country at the moment, I find that surprising.
Yes, it is surprising, but that's what the data says. We just do not have a lot of very, very rich people. We have a few, we have 2 billionaires, neither of them live in the country.
What about Amy Adams? Amy Adams got 6 houses. She told Guy and Escobar, 6 houses, I only have 1.
Work harder. Yeah, but I didn't say there was no one rich, but to tax her on those houses will take a lot of money. To put the marginal tax rate up will cost you 3 lines of code in the IRD tax system. Your choice. I think it's that simple. That's my view of the tax review.
Okay, so I have my first question for you before we go on to the others. Is the tax working group then a step forward, a step back, or just a big fat waste of time?
Curate's egg. The chapter on environmental taxes is really, really good. Has anyone read it? That part of the review is quite good. It's quite insightful. It's providing some good frameworks for thinking about how to use the tax system for environmental problems. The capital gains chapter, it says basically what every tax review has said. This is hard, and they've just added the line that said, but it's worth it. Every other review has said, this is hard, it's not worth it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. We'll have time to dispute with Peter in a second. Applause for Peter. Now it's time for Eric from the New Zealand Initiative to talk to us about what he thinks.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. For my background, I don't have anywhere near the tax background that Peter has. I spent about 13 years lecturing in public economics at the University of Canterbury. I've done a bit of lecturing in Vic on the same thing, and I'm chief economist at the New Zealand Initiative. I'm going to argue that the tax working group hit on some minor issues that are worth addressing and need fixing, but those are kind of the sideshows that nobody's paying attention to. The main deal on capital gains, I agree with Peter, it's not worth the effort. That there are bigger picture issues that need fixing, though, that were left out of the tax working group's assessment, partially because it's not really the fault of the tax system, partially because it wasn't in their terms of reference in the first place. Then I'm going to be in the somewhat uncomfortable position for me, because I consider myself somewhat of a radical on some dimensions, of defending the status quo. What we actually have here for a tax system, when you look around the world, is way better than what is in place in lots of other places. And boy, it would be dumb to break it. So we'll go through these. Minor fixes. Peter alluded to some of the stuff in environmental taxes. I agree with some of the things in there. There'll be minor bits of disagreement, but it's not worth arguing about. There's some interesting bits there. There are some interesting bits around black hole expenditures, about deductions for earthquake strengthening. Those kinds of things need addressing, and it's nice that they look to them. The things that they didn't look at. Everybody's looking at capital gains because they're worried about housing. And it's obvious that we've got huge problems in housing markets, and there's so much stupidity in there, and it's resulted in such inequitable outcomes that piss all of us off. Right? Yes. It's just, you don't fix that through tax. It's totally reasonable to be incensed if your kids are trying to buy into the housing market and somebody else has gotten 10 houses when they were cheap, sat on them, did nothing to fix them, is renting them out for rents are high, but they're not maintaining the houses. You can look at that and see the injustice of it. But imagine what the world would look like if it wasn't effectively impossible to put up new apartments, new terraced housing, and new subdivisions outside of Auckland so that the price of housing could go down. In every other market, we allow supply to adjust to demand, and that keeps prices reasonable. If we look abroad, Houston has had population increases outpacing Auckland by a lot. Housing prices are still around 3 times median income. In Auckland, they're close to 10. And that's because Houston lets people build. They don't lock it all down in regulation. If you want to liquidate the rentiers and the ones that are causing the ones that you might think are causing the housing problem, you do it by allowing an expansion in housing so that the price of housing goes down. You don't do it through tax. The fundamental problem is supply, not tax. So there's a real issue there, but it's not a tax one. It's a housing supply one, but it's partially a tax one. It's partially a tax one in the following sense, which is also ruled out in the terms of reference for the tax working group. It's a problem in how local government funds itself. When local government in Auckland allows more housing, it buys a fight with the NIMBYs, who don't like any change anywhere. It buys a bucket load of infrastructure costs that it can't fund because it's up against its debt ceiling. And central government gets a whack of new income tax revenue, company tax revenue, and GST. Council gets a headache. Central government gets the benefit. Of course they're going to have a fight. Change the tax system there to look at how local and central government fund themselves and the incentives facing local governments so that you can allow housing to grow. So we solve the problem at its root, outside of the remit. Now, if we're starting to think about broad changes to the tax system, like we can all imagine ones that we might think are better. I've got a couple that I think would be kind of fun to think about. They're not nearly well enough developed, and it'd be interesting to have something like the tax working group investigate them more. Progressive consumption taxes are interesting. Land taxes are interesting. Land taxes were ruled out because the terms of reference says you can't think about taxing the land underneath a house. A land tax would have the effect of saying if you're sitting on a big section in downtown Auckland or close to downtown, it's going to be really expensive to keep living there. You might want to sell it to a developer who's going to put up an apartment where 100 people can live instead of just one person who's retired. Land taxes are nice in that, ruled out. They need a lot more thinking yet, but it's something that's worth thinking about. Progressive consumption taxes similarly. You can increase the GST while reducing income tax rates the same way that Key did in 2010, putting more of the burden on tourists, and it's actually a tax on wealth if you think through it, but I won't get into the reasons for it right now. And it puts more of the burden on tourists. You can even offset that by just giving money to poor people at the bottom, which Key did as part of the benefit hikes that came with the tax shift. And that was all good. That would require further investigation too. Another bit that needs more investigation, the really high effective marginal tax rates hitting some people, a very narrow set of people, but who are hitting multiple kinds of benefits that all claw back when they start working. So if you're working for families and a couple other benefits, you really don't see that much in a wage increase. If your employer gives you another $1, the government takes about 90 cents of it back off you. There have to be ways of improving that, but it's all trade-offs and it's all actually hard. And the tax working group wasn't supposed to be looking at it. All right. Now the defense of what we've got. Peter alluded to a bit of this. Just when you look abroad, okay, how many people here actually had to file an income tax return last year? Okay, I'm counting about 40% of the room on an eyeball. In other countries, it's 100%. Here we make taxes really simple, so most people who have really, really simple tax affairs don't have to file. Filing sucks. It's a big pain. Whenever you make taxes more complicated, more people have to file, and the only people who wind up benefiting in those are the ones who have the expensive accountants who can find the ways to avoiding tax. Adding in lots of things that sound like nice ideas often wind up being really good ways to enrich accountants and screw the tax system. So we have to watch out for those. Consider we talk about sugar taxes sometime and the like. Wisconsin, they had a 1,400-word memo defining what was an ice cream sandwich for sales tax purposes, because whether it is going to count as being taxed or not, and that's just one thing, right? We've got a neutral GST, and that's beautiful. In Australia, they had to fly out some European expert to decide whether this new mini ciabatta was a cracker or a bread. This guy's profession is being a bread decider. And the only way you get a profession of bread deciders is when you've got a broken tax system. right? When it matters for tax purposes whether something's a bread or a cracker, well, then you get experts in whether something's a bread or a cracker, and you have to fly them out from Europe to decide for your stupid tax system. Don't break the GST. Nothing in the tax working group proposed breaking the GST. Hurrah! There was a lot of stupid stuff that could have come up and didn't, and we should thank the tax working group for continuing to fight back some of that kind of stupid. So we then wind up in a kind of a defense of the status quo. There are lots of things in New Zealand that suck. Most of those things aren't due to the tax system. There are some things we can think about fiddling around the edges, making sure that the system that has evolved over the past 30 years to take into account that we don't have a capital gains tax continues to evolve over the next 30 years to take into account that we don't have a capital gains tax, and fiddling with that rather than trying to bolt on a new tax onto a regime that's been designed around the absence of it. It gets real complicated real fast, and it'd be dumb to get into it here, and a tax accountant would know way more about it than I would, but I've talked to enough of them, and my God, it's scary. We should be thankful for what we've got. We should despair that some of the things that really matter haven't yet been hit, but it's better to stick with the status quo in some of this than to break what we've got. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Eric. That was super. I'm scared to see that you from the New Zealand Initiative and Peter Wilson from NZIER are largely in agreement. So I think we're going to hear now from Andrew Coleman from the University of Otago and see what he has to say.
Well, can I just ask
Yeah.
a question of Eric?
Sure.
Because, just a question of clarification, because you were talking about the modifications that have been made to deal with not having a capital gains tax, so which is the bright line test, right? So would you be comfortable if the bright line test was extended? Maybe you could explain what it is and whether we think it's a good idea.
Basically, IRD is always watching to find ways that people might be trying to hide income as a capital gain. If you don't have a capital gains tax, there's an incentive to try and disguise what you're doing as being a tax capital gain, when in fact it's a salary for the activities that you're undertaking. If you buy a house, do it up with your own labor. You're not paying income tax on your labor because you're not paying yourself, and then you on-sell it. Well, that's really a return on the labor that you put into fixing that thing, right? It's not just a windfall capital gain or something exogenous. This is a return to your effort, and that's what the tax system is trying to tax. So what they've done to solve that is use a bright line rule. They say that if you buy a house and sell it within a certain number of years, then we're going to consider that to be a taxable income gain. And Peter, I'm sure, can get into way more of the technical details on it than I can, but they keep looking at it to tweak it to make sure that there aren't ways that people could be hiding income as capital gain. Or look to in the stock market. If you tried to run a stock buyback instead of paying a dividend, IRD would come in and say, come on, guys, are you really are you trying to avoid a dividend in doing this, or should we be dealing with you in that way? IRD aren't stupid. They're trying to get as much money out as they can. They're always watching for this stuff. If IRD ended up deciding that the bright line rule needed to change, I'm not going to second guess them on it.
Thanks very much, Anne. When I was invited to come here, Anne said I could talk for 8 minutes, which was very nice of her. And I'd like to start by saying that apparently one of the great things about being a rock star, and of course I don't know this, is that you're remembered for your best songs and not for the stupid things that you do. And of course for politicians, it's completely the other way round. You're always remembered for the worst things that you do. So I'd like to start by talking about Michael Cullen's greatest thing, which is the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, because this is a serious attempt to invest money, accumulate capital, so that in the future taxes won't have to go up so fast. So because some of the interest and dividends earned by the fund will be able to reduce the taxes needed to pay for retirement income in 40 years' time. So this is a great thing. And one of the things that the tax working group has suggested is that we don't tax the superannuation fund any longer. So this year, it paid about $1 billion in taxes, which meant that's $1 billion that's not been accumulated in the fund, and it means that taxes in the future will have to be a bit higher than they otherwise will have been in order, because the money's gone straight to the government. So what the New Zealand Superannuation Fund is really doing, it's taking advantage of the power of compound returns. You put some money aside and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so that's the first good thing about the tax working group's suggestions. Unfortunately, almost all the rest of it disappoints. Now, the problem starts early, and the problem starts where the tax working group identifies the key differences with New Zealand's tax system and the tax systems of the rest of the world. And it says, well, we don't have a capital gains tax. How daft is that? Well, it might be considered fairly daft. And then it says, we have very low environmental taxes. Now, these are two differences we have with the rest of the world, but they're not actually the biggest difference. The biggest single difference between our tax system and the tax systems of the rest of the world is social security taxes. In New Zealand, we pay a social security tax for ACC. It's a tax which is only paid on labour income. Okay, if you earn interest, you don't pay ACC levy. It's only on labour income. And the rest, this is about 1% of GDP in New Zealand. It's about 1/30 of our whole tax take. In the rest of the world, it's 9 or 10% of GDP. It's the single biggest difference between our tax system and the tax systems of the rest of the world. And this document doesn't discuss it. And it doesn't discuss two of the implications of this. The first one is that we have incredibly low taxes on labour incomes in this country. Now, who knew that? Okay, hardly any. We have the third lowest taxes of labour incomes in the world, in the OECD. That's the Rich Countries Club. We also have, by many measures, the highest taxes on capital incomes in the Western world, or in the OECD. And the reason is because we don't have social security taxes. Now, why should this surprise you? Well, what's surprising about the tax working group is that we're starting with very low taxes on personal incomes and labour incomes and very high taxes on capital incomes, and they're suggesting they're not high enough. We should raise taxes on capital incomes. Well, we're already at the top of the world, and we should lower taxes on personal incomes. We're already near the bottom. The tax working group does observe that our strange taxes don't actually make us have a very progressive tax system. So we don't even get a progressive tax system where rich people pay a lot more tax than poor people, even though we have very high taxes on capital incomes and very low taxes on labour incomes. And the tax working group hardly discusses this at all. Now, there's a further sort of strange thing as a sort of, if you ever study tax theory suggests that the tax on capital income should actually be lower than the tax on labour incomes. Okay, now that may say strange to everybody. Why should someone earning $40,000 digging ditches pay more tax than someone getting $40,000 from earning income, earning interest? Well, the answer is that if you tax capital earnings a lot, you tend to reduce the amount of capital innovation and the amount of capital accumulation in the investments, and that lowers wages in the economy. What's the most progressive country in the world? Any guesses? Anyone? Norway. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark all deliberately choose to tax labour incomes at much higher rates than capital incomes. They are the most progressive countries in the world, and why do they do this? They're scared that their businesses will go overseas. They're scared that their business leaders will invest in Germany and France rather than their own countries. Most countries in the world, other than New Zealand, have lower capital taxes on incomes rather than on capital incomes than labour incomes, because they want to get higher wages and higher incomes. And the tax working group has hardly discussed this at all. Now, one of the problems with taxing capital incomes at high rates is that you reduce the ability of young people to take advantage of compound returns. This is the easiest way that many people find to get out of poverty. You save some and you let the returns compound at a high rate of return. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Tax Working Group recommends that the New Zealand Super Fund has its tax reduced so it can take advantage of compound returns. But for the rest of us, it's raising taxes on the return to saving unless you save in owner-occupied housing. What's good for the New Zealand Super Fund apparently is not good for us. This is something that if you live in most countries in the world, it's not done. They tax retirement savings completely differently from the way that we've taxed them since 1989. And this lets you take advantage of the full return from compounding returns to your saving so that you can build up your nest egg and then it's taxed, but you're not taxed as it's compounded. So this is a very big difference between us and the rest of the world. And the Tax Working Groups is sort of saying, hey, we're not going to give you this avenue to return, to get the compound returns to remove you from poverty. We're going to tax you, and we're going to increase that tax rate unless you invest in owner-occupied housing. This scarcely seems to be a well-thought proposal unless you want people to invest more in their own homes. Buy a bigger house, move out of Auckland to Tauranga when you retire. That's the way to make money. It's not the way that we should be trying to propose it. Now, the Tax Working Group doesn't actually, even though it's called the future of tax, doesn't actually have much to say about the future of taxation. It scarcely says anything about the way that taxes are going to have to go up in the future because there's going to be more old people around in the future and because we're all going to live for a longer time. The superannuation taxes, or the amount that we pay in taxes for superannuation, is going up and up and up in the future, and they don't discuss this. This is a shame, but it may be because the Tax Working Group has no one under 40 in it. Okay, so what do you want to do when you're thinking about the future? I know you get as your chairman the guy who was the associate minister and introduced all the tax reforms of the 1980s. And then you get as the next person on the group, Robin Oliver, who was the chief economist in the IRD, who advised him on all these reforms. So here we have Taxman and Robin. So we get to a problem when we say, let's think about the future of tax, and we call up Taxman and Robin, and what do? They go and re-litigate all the things they didn't solve back in 1989. And what was the big thing they didn't solve back in 1989? Capital gains tax. Well, I've got news for Taxman and Robin. The horse has bolted, okay? You're trying to shut the stable gate after we've had the biggest increases in house prices in New Zealand that the world has seen. We actually have topped the OECD since 1989 to 2017 in terms of house price increases, but for the whole OECD, house prices have gone up. So it's been great for his generation and my generation. We made all these capital gains without having to pay tax, and now what does he want to do? Introduce taxes onto the young people following up. What's this likely to do? Well, it's likely to raise rents. It's a double whammy against young people. Taxman and Robin have failed in this account. That by relitigating the issues of the past, we are not solving the problems which are increasingly facing young people and future generations of young people. And it's actually worse than this, and I shall stop soon because you did give me 8 minutes and I'm nearly through with that, I'm sure. Okay.
Taxman and Robin buys you 5 minutes.
One of the gripes I have with this document is that it ignores the biggest two problems facing the world. Now, the biggest problems facing the world aren't actually in New Zealand. They're around the Indian Ocean. There is a burgeoning population in Africa and South India And all these people want to develop, and they want to develop by using more energy. And so what's the biggest two problems of the world? It is, how do we let the peoples of Africa and India and South Asia develop without cooking the planet? No country on Earth has previously developed without burning coal, oil, and gas. Well, it turns out there's a solution. It's called capital-intensive green energy. It's expensive to make energy through hydroelectricity or solar power without having a lot of capital. And these countries are very poor. So what does the world have to do? It needs to recycle the capital surpluses of all the savers in East Asia and in New Zealand and in the rest of the Western world and use it to build green energy plants where they're needed. That's the number one issue in the world. Well, our tax system has two features. Firstly, in terms of providing for retirement income, it doesn't save anything other than the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. We could consider converting to a save-as-you-go system so that people provide for the retirement pensions of the future by actually accumulating capital. The tax working group doesn't talk about that. And secondly, we're increasing the taxes on everything other than owner-occupied housing. So we're going to divert what capital we have to houses. Well, how's that going to build the solar panels that Africa and India need? And the answer is, it isn't. The Green Party, well, I'm not sure what they think, but they have tried to support this tax working group, even though the biggest issue facing our future as a world, it's not contributing at all. And that, I think, is a serious problem. It's not thinking about the future, it's thinking about the past. Well, I've probably gone a little over time because she actually said I was only allowed 7 minutes, and I've been lying about that all the way through. But I'll conclude by saying I really don't think this is a document which is designed to solve the problems of the future, the problems of young people, and it's sort of a wasted opportunity.
Okay, so if you learnt nothing else tonight, Taxman and Robin are stuck in 1989. That was terrific. Thank you so much for taking so much extra time. Geoff, go for it. Geoff Simmons.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks. Kia ora koutou. Hey, firstly, I want to thank you guys for filling a room to talk about tax. How awesome is this to see more than 5 people that care about our tax system? Awesome. Good work. And secondly, I want to thank our speakers because, basically anything to do with politics is, a lot of people, view that as quite a toxic thing. We don't want to be involved. And I'm saying, but, we want to present a variety of views. We want to get a debate going. None of these guys are pushing the Opportunities Party policy here tonight. They're putting their own views forward to get debate going. And so I want to thank them for coming along and contributing. So big round of applause. And yes, as has been pointed out on social media, it is a manel. I didn't just invite men to talk, but these guys were the ones that were able to do it. So I thank them for coming along and contributing. So what have we heard tonight? Well, and I also want to thank Anne for emceeing. Wonderful. Anne is not a man, yeah. So what have we learnt tonight? Well, Peter started us off saying that incomes are not the problem. And this is the really interesting difference between New Zealand and other countries like the United States. We see on social media a lot of stuff about incomes being flat since the 1970s, and that's all from the United States. It's actually not the case here. Incomes have been growing since the mid-1990s. Yes, there were big reforms in the 80s and early 90s, but since the mid-90s, incomes have been growing in line with productivity. Our productivity has been crap, but whatever businesses have made, they have been sharing with workers, okay? So businesses are not to blame for skimping on paying workers, at least since the mid-90s. So that's not the driver of inequality. We've heard from all of the other speakers here tonight, businesses are paying their fair share in New Zealand. Compared to the rest of the world, businesses are paying a lot more. I'm talking about domestic businesses, not you Facebook, not you Google, but certainly domestic businesses, Kiwi businesses are paying their fair share. So there's no issue there. So why have we got homelessness? Why have we got growing lines at the food banks? And the answer is housing. And New Zealand is really unique in this case. It is a housing story. Housing is the reason that the rich have got richer. Almost all of the increase in wealth has come because of housing. Housing is the reason the poor have gotten poorer. Since records began in the early 1990s, when they started recording rents have been growing faster than wages. And if you're on a benefit, well, God help you, because you're linked to inflation. So they have been hammered. So if you are in the bottom 10% of population in New Zealand, you are no better off today in real terms than you were in 1980. No better off. In fact, probably slightly worse off. And that is almost entirely because of housing. We complain about the cost of living and petrol prices and food prices every winter when cauliflower goes up or whatever, and we, everyone freaks out about that or whatever. But it's housing. Housing in the long term has been the consistent story. And as Andrew pointed out, we are unique in having a very different tax regime on housing from all other assets. So, as Andrew pointed out, in a lot of countries, they overcome this problem by reducing the tax on a bunch of other assets. Okay, so to stop people sticking all their money into housing, we will make saving for your superannuation really, really attractive. So people are just as likely to stick their money into their super fund as they are into their family home or buying rental properties. We haven't done that in New Zealand. Okay? Part of the drawback with what Andrew's saying is that it's expensive. If we're going to reduce the cost on other forms of capital, we need to get the money from somewhere. And that's why you see countries like Scandinavia putting up the top tax rate. That's where they get their money from. Okay? Everyone who talks about these countries being extremely progressive and having hugely progressive tax rates, yes, absolutely. But they also don't tax capital very much at all. That's why their inequality statistics are not that different from ours. So that's an important part of that conversation. The other possibility here is to tax the family home. As these guys have pointed out, just taxing rental property is not going to make that much of a difference. The family home is roughly 2/3 of our housing stock, 3/4 of the value of our housing stock, because the family home is generally more valuable than a rental property. But we have fewer people in the family home than we stick in rental properties. In fact, we could solve homelessness in New Zealand and every family home would still have a spare bedroom. One of the fascinating findings from Andrew's report that came out a couple of years ago is that the size of our family homes has been increasing faster than any other country in the world. So what have we been doing with that tax advantage? We've been sticking it into making bigger, better family homes. And as these guys have pointed out, if that tax advantage, if that massive tax advantage that already exists, if you slap a capital gains tax on other assets, that relative tax advantage just gets even bigger. So what we'll see is just what we see in Australia, the mansion effect. Why buy a housing? Why buy a rental property? Why invest in farms? Why invest in a business when I can just buy the place next door, knock it down, and put a tennis court on there and call it the family home? Land banking. It's a wonderful thing. Just to finish off, in terms of, one thing I do disagree on is with Eric on that the tax system can make a difference. Eric mentioned land taxes. Yes, that's a tax that can give it an incentive to improve supply. And our tax proposal, the Opportunities Party tax proposal, which is basically to tax all assets the same as we tax a bank deposit. Every asset has to pay the same amount of tax as a bank deposit. Family home, empty land, everything. That would work in a similar way to a land tax in terms of giving people an incentive to develop land if they're sitting on an empty land bank, for example. Yes, I'm finishing up now. So, yes, supply is a problem, and yes, we need to reform. We definitely need to reform the laws around supply in this country to get more houses built. But I would argue that tax is a big part of that as well. Tax can actually influence supply, and it can influence demand as well, because, like I said, that tax differential between other assets and the family home is so massive in New Zealand, and it'll stay the same with the tax working group. Can I abuse my position right now to ask all these guys a quick question? So I just want to know, because if you don't know, the Tax Working Group main report came out and proposed a so-called comprehensive capital gains tax on everything except the family home, right? And we've talked about how big a problem that is. But the minority report talked about excluding businesses. And I just wanted to check with these gentlemen whether they thought the minority report, putting a capital gains tax on residential property, whether they would see that as a small step forward or a complete waste of time.
Probably a waste of time. It's a small tax base. It's run by small business people. Won't raise a lot of income, and I still struggle to see what the problem that it's going to solve is. There's been this view in New Zealand official circles that putting taxes on houses will somehow reduce rents. And I'm just a humble tax economist who spent my entire career thinking about it. I don't know how that works. If anyone could enlighten me, I'd love to know. As far as I can tell, particularly when you've got constrained supply, if you tax it, it'll be passed on in higher rent. So I don't think increasing rents is a good idea, so no.
The proposal to exempt stock investments and business generally from capital gains tax is not... it is less bad than the more comprehensive one that would include that part of the economy as well. We always have to weigh up the distortion that you get when you leave one side out and tax the other side, but my God, it gets complicated in stock portfolios and trying to assess capital gains across that and the disincentives to savings, and taking into account that we're a capital poor country, that we need to have a lot more capital and we shouldn't be trying to tax things we want to have more of. It's good to carve that part out. If IRD decided that it is okay to extend the kind of bright line rule to rental properties and maybe make it tighter on rental, rats and mice, I'm not as worried about it. It would be a very bad idea to start putting capital gains onto, like, everybody keeps talking about, this is only going to hit the top 10% that have all these houses. It's every freaking KiwiSaver portfolio in the proposal that's gone up from the tax working group. And that's just about, that's most wage and salary earners, right? You don't want to do that. So there's a theory of the second best that we worry about some of the... On net, I prefer it, but it's still better to just avoid the whole area. Look at other changes.
Cool, thanks. Now, Andrew.
Last year I was asked by the tax working group actually to write a paper about exactly this issue. And so we did a model, and a model is a model. It's, run on a computer, and it sort of tries to work out what happens, ask the question, what happens if you only put a capital gains tax on rental housing, but not owner-occupied housing, and you tax people taking into account the inflation. And the answer is is that it was likely to raise rents and it would make most low-income people worse off. 70% of low-income persons would be worse off because it wouldn't raise enough money to refund the increase in rent. Now, it's just a model, it's a mathematical thing. I don't really know what the numbers are, but the best model that we came up with said this. Incidentally, when we said what would happen if you put a capital gains tax on owner-occupied housing and rental housing, instead of having 70% of low-income people worse off, it said 70% of low-income people would be better off.
Can you repeat that?
Well, the numbers are rough because, I've got limited memory, but it said if you put a tax only on landlords, then about 70% of low-income people would be worse off because the rents would be going up and there wouldn't be enough revenue taken to recompense, there's probably a word like that somewhere, than for the higher rents they pay. But if you put it on all housing, 70% of low-income people would be better off because rents wouldn't be going up by so much. House prices would fall by more, so it makes it easier to buy your own home, and you're earning a lot more income because you're taxing everybody, and the refunding of that income would make 70% of low-income people better off. So one's 70% worse off and the other's 70% better off. But that's outside the scope of the tax working group, so they weren't really doing that. They weren't asked to do that, but that's what the numbers came out as.
Fantastic, thank you. So that was pretty interesting. We've got 4 economists. Typically, economists are said to be the people you can put end to end and never reach a conclusion. But I think they've reached a conclusion, and that is that the tax working group report and the minority report are disappointing. Maybe it's because it wasn't in the terms of reference, that they didn't get the terms of reference right. Maybe they're living in the past, Taxman and Robin, stuck in 1989. Or maybe it's just that we had a really good system in the first place and we shouldn't fix it if it's not broke. And Mr. Simmons here on my left, who's got some other bright ideas, which sound a lot like what Dr. Coleman just said. So I'm going to hand over to you guys now to interrogate these people. I know you've got lots of questions. Lady down the back's got questions. Can I have the hand, first of all, of someone under the age of 30 to ask the first question, since this is future tax. It's about the future. So someone under 30, hand up now. Yes.
This gentleman over here, sorry, I forgot your name. Andrew. You were saying that New Zealand, was it you who were saying New Zealand has some of the highest tax rates on capital in the world?
Yeah, that's what the OECD says. That's what the IMF says. That's what Pricewaterhouse says.
Yeah. Okay, so how is that the case?
It's partly, most other countries, you pay a social security tax, which you only pay on labour income. Okay, so if you live in America, for instance, and you earn $50,000, you would pay social security taxes of 8% on that whole $50,000, but you probably wouldn't pay much income tax. In fact, if you had a couple of kids, you wouldn't pay any income tax at all. So you pay tax on your labour income, which is social securities, but you don't pay that tax on your capital income. So that's actually the mechanism by which it happens. Whereas we pay tax on everything. On all income equally. Most countries separate it out and say that, look, for your retirement, you put money on your social security tax and that goes into your retirement sort of account and that determines how much pension you get in the future. But you don't have to pay tax on your capital, your interest and your dividends or your extra business earnings and so forth like that. Now, the business earnings, which are a labour income, yeah, you pay it on that, but you don't pay it on ordinary profits. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
There's one other reason why we're higher in New Zealand is we don't have tax concessions on capital income tax. We don't have accelerated depreciation, we don't have R&D tax credits. So we have a very broad base of income tax on companies compared with other countries. The rate might be low compared with other countries, but the base is very, very wide, and that's another part of it.
Is that because we have GST, and that means poor people can't escape from GST? They have to pay it no matter what.
Well, it's not why we have GST, but it's a consequence of GST. I mean, GST is the same as tax on labour income, and a tax on accumulated wealth, which is, Eric's very, very important. And in New Zealand, it's a brilliant tax on tourists. Most other countries, tourists get a refund of GST when they leave. We tax the shit out of them. There's a lot of them. We should
Have a chair, please.
we should send them a little thank you card. We make billions of dollars. Well, the central government makes billions of dollars out of tourists. Local government has to pay for the capital costs, and that is, I agree again, economists agreeing, that giving a bit of that revenue to local government would probably make life a lot better for them and for the tourists.
Fantastic. So now you see why tax is so extraordinarily interesting. I'm going to take a question now from someone who is over the age of 30 but under the age of 40, because this is about the future.
And doesn't wear a hat. And doesn't wear a hat.
So we're obviously going to go up progressively in age as the evening goes on. My question...
I think the microphone is just for the camera.
Okay, sorry, I'll speak a little bit higher so everyone else can hear. Sorry, people on the internet, if you're getting blasted right now. Eric, you said that although we have a very different rate of tax on owner-occupied housing compared to other things, we don't have a lot of owner-occupied housing compared to, we've still got a lack of housing. And you mentioned a couple of reasons why more housing is not being built. Can I get you to extend on that a little bit more? More reasons why we don't have more houses, despite this big difference tax treatment, and maybe the others can also
There
give their
is
opinion.
a big, huge, complicated mess in housing supply, and it worries the hell out of me because fixing any one part of it won't be enough, and advocating for fixing the first part won't result in more housing because then you hit your head on the next branch in the path, and then you hit your head on the next branch in the path unless you clear the whole thing. But let's go through it. Okay, so we start with the problem of incentives, right? The incentives are what drove local councils to set rules in their local plans that rebuilt all of the restrictiveness of the old Town and Country Planning Act into the new RMA. Nobody forced them to be really restrictive in their district plans under the RMA. They chose to do it because of the incentives they faced. All right. So first, we need to ease up zoning so that you can build density where people want to live, but that requires councils to be able to fund the infrastructure for it. They want to restrict it because the infrastructure is expensive. Similarly for greenfields, if you look at Auckland, Watercare, if they lay out a pipe, they need to get a return on that investment real fast. Otherwise, it's not paying for itself, right? Their council is facing these overall debt limits. So you restrict land supply because of the financial incentives you're facing. But that by itself isn't enough either. Okay, if you get the pipes open, there's still incentives to kind of drip feed land unless you also let people build kind of out of sync. If everybody knows that a water care pipe is going in here, and then here in 10 years, and then here 10 years after that to ensure a 30-year land supply, everybody has incentive to land bank and to drip feed land into the market because that's what keeps your prices up. How do you get around that? Allowing people to build out of sync and outside of that. You have to come up with mechanisms for infrastructure financing to come up with other ways of getting that infrastructure in that don't depend on water care and don't depend on council. Another area, building material supply. Brands basically created a cartel where it's really, really hard to get new building materials certified, and you need thousands of different building materials in a house, right? Think about all the different kinds of wire nails and wire and jib and bits of board, just everything that goes into a house. Every one of them costs about $1,200 to get certified by brands, and if you're the first one to get it certified, the benefits go to everybody else who then imports next. You can't just parallel import the stuff out of Vancouver or Seattle or Tokyo, places that we would trust as being sensible. It's not like crappy stuff out of China that you might be worried about if you think that's what happens. Vancouver's wet and shaky. Seattle's wet and shaky. Tokyo's been shaky forever. They've also got wetness issues. It's insane to think that materials out of those places are not as good. But even if you relax those restrictions, councils are faced with joint and several liability. Councils have to sign off on a building permit at the end of it, saying that, yes, we trust that this building has been good enough. If they get that wrong, they get sued under the precedent established under leaky buildings, and then they're liable for everything that goes wrong. That means they're insanely risk-averse, and they will not sign off on anything that doesn't follow standard procedure. And standard procedure is defined in terms of the materials that brands has already certified. Say, if you want to join up the wall in this way, you have to use this kind of jib and you have to use this kind of board. Okay, well, we have to do that, otherwise council won't sign off on it. So you have to change council liability so that they're not under joint and several anymore, but instead are solely under proportionate. And the Law Commission said, oh, no, that's too, the Law Society said that's too hard to get rid of joint and several. But they were mostly worried about contractors and subcontractors and the builder. They weren't worried about council. Get council restricted to proportionate liability, not joint and several liability, and let the builders sort that other part amongst themselves, and let council be less worried about signing off on things. It's just this big whole set of things. Okay, other guys that are prepared to build 1,000-house subdivisions out of the States, they can't even come here and do it because we've made it basically illegal for foreign suppliers to come in and build houses. And they wouldn't be able to bring their labor with them if they wanted to because we've made it too hard to bring workers in. And they wouldn't be able to bring in their trusted suppliers because they'll have supply chains that they already trust and know how to build the houses to, but we screwed that up too. It's this huge, complicated mess that has nothing to do with tax. It has everything to do with our housing problem. Like tax does enter into it, but it's not the fundamental underlying cause. The tax distortion coupled with a responsive supply system would have no effect. Right? You just keep building more houses and you wouldn't have the capital gains.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. We're all illuminated, and so are you. I want another question from an under 40-year-old, please. Anyone else? Want to make sure you've had... Yes.
If we have a capital gains tax, we're likely to have payback for capital losses on housing. How do we treat capital losses on housing once landlords have already profited from the giant increase they've had already, where we have to take a valuation day approach and then we're going to be double subsidising them for the losses they may make from the valuation day past, I don't know, April 1st, 2021, and that's under the capital...
I'll have a go. This is why you don't have a capital gains tax. Devil's in the detail. You get all these stupid rules about, and you get asymmetries of treatment. We don't want to make it retrospective because that's bad, but we'll allow the losses to be retrospective. And you have to ring fence and so my basic view about this tax is that the one you have in practice is stupid. So let's not have it. The one you have, if I was asked to write a theory of a perfect capital gains tax, it would be an elegant thing, a thing of beauty. No government would ever get re-elected if they proposed it, but it would be fair and equitable and efficient. But politics plus capital taxes just don't mix. And you get rules like this about, what you do about this. So, and I've told the Minister of Revenue this, that whatever bill he puts into the House, if he's crazy enough to do this, what comes out of the House will be orders of magnitude worse. No tax bill in my experience has got simpler through the parliamentary process. And I've been through a lot of parliamentary processes of tax bills because there will be examples presented like that, and Mrs. Smith from Otago who, is asset rich and cash poor and so blah, 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 and this house and that house. Just don't have them. Put the top marginal tax rate up if you need income.
Peter, hang on. Peter, that sounds to me like that's very courageous, Minister.
Oh yes. Sir Humphrey would. I'm an old-style public servant. I've told many ministers, if you really want to do this, Minister, read this press release that announces the policy. If you have cold shudders, come and talk to me. Because, there was a famous, I think it was a Dutch Prime Minister, when talking about microeconomic reform in Europe. He said, we all have worked out what we need to do to reform the European economy. We just haven't worked out how to be re-elected afterwards.
Okay, Eric.
It gets even worse, right? So everything that I talked about in the housing problem, it comes down to incentives around local councils. Imagine what happens when central government has a strong incentive to not fix the housing problem because they're going to have massive capital losses that they're going to have to either compensate people for or ring fence around. You don't want, like right now, the only thing that gives me hope is that Twyford sees the problem. He understands the supply issues. Kiwi Build's a sideshow, but he understands the other underlying issues, and maybe he'll get it worked through. Once he's facing incentives that IRD is going to lose a whole pile of money because of capital losses, if he gets supply right and housing prices can start coming down, it's just doom, right?
Fantastic. Okay, what about all the over 40s who are sitting in a house that's worth more now than it used to be, and they've got spare bedrooms? Questions from you guys?
This is outrageous. You guys are outrageous. There you all are talking about no capital gains tax, but this is unfair. Unfair to the workers, unfair to the people who unfair to the people who earn wages as their income. I see the rich earning a lot of money out of capital gains. What are you going to do about the fairness?
Look, I totally agree. I think our current tax system is unfair, but unless you include owner-occupied housing, you're wasting your time. That is the biggest tax break here. We've all got to look at ourselves. That's the biggest tax break, the biggest asset in this entire country, 42% of our country. And if you leave that exempt, you just open the door for rich people to find more loopholes, to build mansions, all that sort of stuff. It is a nightmare waiting to happen. So totally agree with you. It's not fair, but unless we're prepared to look ourselves in the mirror over owner-occupied housing, waste of time.
The biggest unfairness that we've got is how people who bought houses 30 years ago have managed to set the rules to prevent anybody else from building houses now. Okay, it has screwed every future generation. It's inequitable, and the only way to fix it is to allow more building. That's the biggest inequity. Otherwise, equity issues are better dealt with through the benefit system. Working for families works really well for that. It provides increased returns for people who are in work. You have to look at tax and benefit as a whole, right? You try and use the tax system to raise whatever money the government decides it needs to do whatever it wants to do. You try and do that in the way that's least damaging to the economy as a whole, and then use the money that you raise in equitable ways. And then we start looking at the kinds of things that we're doing, right? The way that tobacco tax falls in highly inequitable ways when we could be adjusting that a little bit. I won't get into the whole mess, but I would fix housing supply so that housing costs can come down.
Can I there's a reason why I live in Auckland, and house prices, I have a house in Auckland that earns more money than I do in its gain. And I want to talk to you about this, boss. This is unfair. I should get paid more. But anyway, why I could reduce, as an official, I could reduce the price of houses in Auckland tomorrow by just just moving the urban regional boundary. Why doesn't the government do that? Because 60% of the voters own their own house. And that's the reason why politicians pay lip service to doing something about housing costs, because the current 60% of people who own their own house just say, go renty. Let's have more house price inflation. I'm getting richer. My bank will allow me to borrow against the accumulated gain. And if you fix that problem, you wouldn't get re-elected.
Sorry, that's not true. Which bit? Well, basically, you could abolish the urban-rural boundary, and I support that entirely. But that's a very simplistic view of looking at things. At the end of the day, you also have to provide the infrastructure to enable the houses to be built there. And that's actually where the real constraint is. So you could abolish this boundary, but at the end of the day, who's providing the water? Well, Auckland Council is absolutely at their debt limit. Who's providing the highway infrastructure? Well, if you actually look at central government, they're not providing any of the main transport links, the railways, they're well behind on their program. So we're talking really a complex problem here. To suggest that there's a simple solution of, oh yes, we'll just erase this invisible boundary that exists around Auckland, is a little bit one-dimensional.
No, it's not. I'm not one-dimensional. This is from Eric, but I'm going to claim authority. I live in Auckland. Auckland's population has been increasing dramatically the last 2 years. Two markets are not clearing. Sorry, jargon point. Supply is not keeping up with demand in two markets. Transport, land, both under the purview of Auckland Council. Every other market is clearing. The schools are being built. There are no queues at the cinemas. Vector, that I used to work for, that provides infrastructure for gas and electricity, no queues. I just make that point. Every other market is clearing except for the two controlled by local government. That's the problem, not that it's complex. You're asking the wrong people to do it. Privatise water care, it'll be fixed.
As a rebuttal, where does 50% of the funding for local roads come from? Correct.
Actually, it all comes from motorists.
But who's it administered by?
Auckland Council.
And NZIER?
Not for the local roads. Anyway, that's detail.
Well, who thought tax was... Hang on.
I just can I leap in on supply? I just want to.
You want to leap in on supply?
Yeah. Just. I mean, and yes, supply is important. I'm not denying this, but Auckland did not have a housing shortage in 2007, and yet prices then were 6 times the average household income. Now, the affordable international benchmark is 3. There's plenty of places in New Zealand right now that don't have problems building houses, and they've still got housing markets that are now 6-1. So, and I come back to Andrew's point about the size of the average family home and the amount of spare bedrooms that we've got. We actually don't have a housing crisis. We've got a matching crisis. We've got an accommodation crisis. So, I think to somehow think that the tax system is no part of this whatsoever, I find a little bit naive, particularly when land banking is such a big part of this. Yeah.
The same construction cost problems hit the whole country, though, right? The cartel that's been created by government regulation that the Commerce Commission will never look at, that'll never show up at the Commerce Commission's conferences, that'll never show up in a market study because government loves enforcing its own cartels. That, what is that adding? 30% to the cost of a house?
Yeah, but
35?
But the key driver has been land price increases, not building costs. That's
But when if you're looking outside of Auckland to other markets, that you start getting construction costs are what's going to start binding, and then availability of construction workers and the stupid system that it's a whole systems problem.
Okay, that's great. They're talking amongst themselves.
I'm going to take my right of prerogative because and that's because I've been 43 for 6 years, and I think that still makes me over 40 and under 50. So I think I'm allowed to talk. On fairness, yes, on fairness, there's 2 issues. Fairness doesn't have to be effective, right? And so what we're really talking about with our capital gains tax is it's not a particularly well-designed proposal. It's taxing the inflation component of capital gains, and it's not taxing owner-occupied housing, okay? So it's possible to design a capital gains tax which might meet your criteria of fairness, but it's not the one that's on the table. And the second thing is a lot of things that don't seem fair aren't actually effective. And as I say, tax theory says actually it might sound fair to tax capital and labour at the same rate, but it's not effective because that lowers wages. So you need to always balance this. And there's a lot of economic theory, 2 Nobel Prize winners, Merlis and Diamond, who talk about the trade-off between what works and what seems to be fair. And that's what you really need to take into account.
Thank you very much. That was terrific, Andrew. So I want to hear from women now because they've been conspicuous, apart from our friend at the back, conspicuously quiet. I see there's a question here.
Thanks. I couldn't agree more, Eric, that there's a problem in the building sector. It's actually Jenny St. Lisa's portfolio, Minister of Building, not Twyford's problem.
It's a mix, but yes.
You've talked about how other countries have reduced their tax on other forms of capital to incentivise people to invest in homes and super. What you haven't talked about is New Zealand's chronically low productivity rate. Chronically low productivity rate. And if you were to have a capital gains tax, either on gains or on capital, what should the government do to actually incentivise investments in productive assets? I feel like that's been missing from this panel.
I agree. This is at the heart of the issue, is what types of taxes are going to lead to higher incomes and higher wages, and does that counter our fairness concepts? And in most countries, they look for lower taxes on capital incomes, and the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, the Danes are completely explicit about this. They make the tax on your interest and dividends and your profits at the lowest marginal tax rate. Well, that's still in the 20s because they're a high tax country. And then your income tax, your marginal tax rate on income, goes right up into the 50s. Okay, and so they're quite explicit in saying you don't want to disadvantage businesses from doing new inventions, from investing in productive capital, which raises the wages of themselves and their workers. And there's a lot of new evidence which shows that if you raise the taxes on capital incomes, actually workers don't get the pay rises they otherwise would have. Now, the evidence comes brilliantly from Germany, where all the local bodies have their own tax rate on capital incomes. And the ones which raise their tax rate the following year, their workers don't get pay rises like everybody else. So the evidence is really quite clear that if you tax capital incomes too highly, the businesses won't be making the productivity-enhancing investments, and the workers won't be getting the wage rises. And that's one of those ideas between the balance between fairness and what works, what's effective. And it's not clear that we're at that right end of the balance. We're at the top end of the taxes on capital income. If you start a small, medium-sized business in New Zealand, the World Bank and the Pricewaterhouse company, Pricewaterhouse, whoever they are, Coopers, they say we have the highest taxes in the OECD if you're starting up a medium-sized business in New Zealand, right? That's not going to lead to the investment and the high wages that we need. And I think that's at the heart of the issue. So I think I agree with you.
Good question. At the back?
I'm just trying to get my head around what you've just said, Andrew, but my question was around how we correct the inefficiencies in investment in property at the moment, where basically people are using that to accumulate wealth. And
right. Well, there's sort of two approaches. If you think about three classes of assets, so I'm going to have your own house, owner-occupied housing, your retirement savings in a special KiwiSaver account or its equivalent overseas, and everything else. Okay, so everything else you would think is the big one, but actually owner-occupied housing in New Zealand's the big one. But just imagine you've got three piles, and you can tax them at two different rates. There's something we call you tax it when you spend the money, a consumption tax, or you tax it at an income rate, and that's the high one. Well, in New Zealand, we have the same income tax rates on these two, and a much lower tax rate on owner-occupied housing, okay? And so one way of fixing this is to raise the tax on owner-occupied housing. And so then all three piles will have the same rates, and there's no incentive to invest in your own home relative to other things. But most of the rest of the world has said, okay, we're going to have tax on owner-occupied housing like this, just the same as New Zealand, but the middle pile, retirement savings, we reduce the tax to the same weight as the tax on owner-occupied housing. And then all the rich people who have other assets, well, they'll have to pay the higher taxes. But for most people then, there's the same type of taxes on your retirement savings, KiwiSaver, and your owner-occupied house, so that there's an incentive to invest in productive capital-owning businesses across for most people. And that's the solution that most countries have adopted. Back in 1989, we did this. And then a lot of our debate is, should we do this and try and make it even, which is what the tax working group is sort of trying to do. But the other solution is to lower this. Now, I suspect Geoff and I are in different camps. I believe that the solution is to just follow the rest of the world because it's proven to work and go back to what we used to do on our retirement taxes and make occupied housing and the rest of your retirement savings taxed at the same basis. So that's my solution, would fix some of those problems which create an incentive to invest in one class of assets other than the other. And the tax working group unfortunately dismisses this as a solution. Sorry?
Is that because they weren't supposed to look at productivity?
Well, no, they were supposed to look at productivity. They just didn't bother. But what most countries do when they have a low tax on retirement savings is that they have a steep marginal tax rate. Okay, and so yes, rich people can get higher savings on the taxes they put in their KiwiSaver, but actually that's offset by a higher marginal tax rate. We have one of the very lowest marginal tax rates in the country, and the tax working group is sort of hidden behind the Labor government's direction, which is don't change the top marginal tax rate. Okay, so we've got a sort of a Labor government which is saying, oh, you should have the lowest taxes for rich people in the world. Okay, they're not quite the lowest taxes, but they're getting down there. You know, Australia has a rate of 40, America has 39.6, and that comes in at $400,000. We're nowhere close to that. So that's one of the solutions would be to raise the top marginal tax rate and introduce a rebate on your retirement savings. Okay, we might not want to do that, but that's what the rest of the world does.
We've heard it from three of them now. Raise the top tax rate. It was. It was.
I mean, just a technical correction. Housing in New Zealand, owner-occupied housing, is taxed at zero. Zero. Wow. The income is taxed very, very lowly. So it's not quite sort of retirement savings and housing down here. It's up there a bit. But the really good way to reform the tax system is to spend less money. When I was Director of Tax Policy, Ireland was the thing, and they were booming. You had the Celtic Tigers, and they had this really low income tax rate, and everything was wonderful. And I actually went to Dublin. I actually stood in the tax haven of Dublin Docks, and I couldn't feel the productivities happening. But anyway, my counterpart in the Irish Treasury had a really easy job because the EU gave them €4 billion a year in subsidies. So his job was to raise the amount of revenue the government needed to fund all their programs, less €4 billion. Sweet. We could make the tax system a lot better in New Zealand if we reduced spending first. And then we could do a lot of these reforms, because the tax review's mandate was revenue neutral. And that's really hard because you've got to put someone else's taxes up. If you had a revenue negative, if they'd gone to the tax working group and said, we've decided to reduce wasteful expenditure by $4 billion a year, how should we spread that saving across the tax system? That would have been a fun report. And I think that is really where we've got to get to. Taxes, you don't have them, they're awful. If it wasn't for the need we needed to spend money, we wouldn't have them. So the real debate should be reduce spending.
Okay, so is anyone going to self-combust if they don't ask a question, or is it beer o'clock?
I think we both want to comment on.
You want to comment? You want to go have a go at productivity?
Just that last question about. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just to finish off. So, well, I think Andrew's point is dead right. You know, we've got the tax on owner-occupied housing way down here and other assets up here. I mean, there's basically two ways to reform the tax system, right? You need to drop the tax on other assets, which is Andrew's solution, and in which case you need to get money from somewhere. He's suggesting top marginal tax rate, or you can do a bit of both. You can lift the tax on owner-occupied housing and use that to reduce the tax on other assets and try and meet that in the middle. And that's kind of the Opportunities Party, approach. But I agree with Andrew. That to me is that's an entirely acceptable solution as well. The difference with doing what the Opportunities Party is suggesting is that it reduces inequality at the same time, because you're hitting people with wealth who aren't currently paying tax. I mean, this is the one fact that freaks me out about tax in New Zealand, is that a third of the wealthiest people don't pay the top rate of income tax. So yes, people pay, people with high incomes pay a lot of income tax, but wealthy people don't necessarily pay income tax. They do pay GST, yeah.
Sure. Kind of quick point tying together a couple of questions there. So you asked about productivity. Look, this is a huge problem, and there is no good answer to it yet. So there's lots of different answers. None of them have been well tested against the data, and some of it's almost impossible to test against the data. Mike Riddell is pretty convinced that immigration is underlying it. I think he's wrong, but it's hard to test. I think it was Solo that said that once you start thinking about economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. I think, for me, once you start thinking about problems in land use planning, it's hard to think about anything else. Think about Auckland and how we construct our productivity statistics. Every time that businesses in Auckland become more productive because of economies through agglomeration, so everything becomes more productive with scale, right? And there's this weird thing going on where bigger cities are becoming better at being cities than smaller cities, and it's happening more quickly. All of the benefits of that, when you've locked up land use, wind up turning into increased rents. Rents are a cost when you're figuring out productivity, because productivity is how much the value of your output divided by the value of your inputs. Rents fall into your inputs, okay? So some of it is going to be problems in land use planning. There's been work in the States showing massive gains in productivity if you were able to unlock some of these land use issues so that people could move to places where they would be more productive and businesses could expand in places where they're more productive, rather than being like you're in this horrible equilibrium where if you're stuck in a really crappy place and you could be a lot more productive somewhere else, if you sell up your house, you'll never be able to afford to move to Silicon Valley because, God, you can't afford to be any kind of professional there. You think Auckland is becoming comparably bad, okay? Once you start thinking about that, the first order productivity gains then start coming in land use planning rather than tax. And like I agree with Andrew and a lot of the principle here that you want to get parity across these things. I kind of like the idea of I worry that the tax that we get on inflation in some of what we do, not just if we have capital gains, which would make it even worse, but if we look at taxation of interest earnings. So if a business is trying to fund itself through debt, you're paying, it's earning nominal interest. The tax comes into on nominal issues rather than on real. That distorts everything. It's comparably hard to set up a real-based tax system rather than a nominal one as compared to putting on a capital gains tax. I think it'd be a little bit more useful. And that then ties back into how we deal with some of these other, the productivity issues in tax. All of this comes back, I think, to land use planning. And while I agree with you on a lot of the principle in getting things around parity, yeah, I know. Yes, I know it's hard, but
these guys officially don't
I think it'd be better to figure out how to have a real-based tax system than to try and figure out how to deal with capital gains in the current New Zealand tax system.
Fantastic. I think it's a great place to stop. We've got 4 economists here who agree with each other. The tax working group had the wrong terms of reference. They lived in the past, Taxman and Robin, back in 1989. They didn't really grasp the nettle and they got distracted by things that weren't relevant. So can we have a big round of applause for the rock stars? And it's now beer o'clock.